Hello everyone, this is Talisman Skulls. I'm commenting some questions about the whole uh, Trinitarian type goddess concept, since a lot of people want to push that particular issue, which is rather silly that they have to do so. But hey, whatever strokes their egos, I guess. The main thing is that the concept of the Trinity goddess that people keep running around preaching about today uh, is actually contradictory to the concept that Gerald Gardner and his Bricket Wood coven had originally constructed, and they only adopted the Robert Graves model rather late, about around just right after the 60s, early part of the 70s. In any case, the true monotheistic single Trinitarian goddess concept has been pretty much warped to basically be a feminine version of the Catholic Trinity. And so when you really cut out all the brass tacks, nonsense crap that we have today and people not actually doing serious research, that's pretty much what it's all about. It's a bunch of reactionary nonsense and only wanting to see what you want to see rather than actually researching the history and the sources of their information to see if their claims can be justified. And 90% of them can't. Also, if you take in consideration the way the triple goddess concept is presented, it's actually far more misogynistic than anything else, and that's actually what makes it funny that so many goddess worshippers fail to realize this, because it pretty much presents the concept that one, virgin basically has to be an unmarried slut and isn't intelligent enough to be wiser than that. Two, that all women have to be on some level a mother type figure, even though they may not actually want children for whatever reason. Not that they hate kids, they just don't want to have any of their own, which is perfectly reasonable. And but yet pretty much excludes women of childbearing age of being wise. And three, only an old lady apparently has any kind of capability of any kind of wisdom, insight, or realization about the reality of the world around them. And also somehow an older woman in her elder years can't be somewhat attractive in her own way. So when you really cut out all the crap instead of what's all promoted, the whole concept of the Maiden Mother Crone thing is actually very condescending, very unrealistic, and fairly destructive to the psyche of women in general, because it literally tries to proclaim that in order to be true to the goddess, you have to follow this rigid pattern, and that's not realistic. So those who try to say that the triple goddess goes all the way back to the Celts and everything like that, that's actually not true. To try and say it's the Maiden Mother Crone model is directly related to the Greek pantheons is not true. In fact, a lot of times your triple goddess type imagery can be three sisters, three cousins, or an aspect of a goddess represented in three forms, but all of them tend to be consistent within either a warrior goddess, and therefore has different aspects of that. Sometimes compassionate as a defender, sometimes brutal as a warmonger, and sometimes as one that's more of a factor of justice and retribution, so it kind of varies. There are actually very few motherly figures in anything of any so-called Celtic, Germanic, or whatever origins. They are referred to as mothers only in the context of their superiority over all other beings, putting them in a ruling mother-type fashion. That does not mean that they're nurturing. That's actually false. Plus, you also have to take in consideration most of the legends and myths were written down by Catholic sources with a bunch of interpretations counter to what the culture is most likely to have actually believed. And this isn't saying that all of it's wrong, but a good percentage of it is entirely biased. So if you base your concepts and try to basically whitewash what's already written, you can't be certain of the fact that the details that you're claiming are consistent with anything that hasn't had any outside source written records from the culture itself that has preserved those ideas. Otherwise, you just get a bunch of loose pieces of information archaeology, and you have to also recognize there were a lot of figures that were only mentioned once by name, and they were probably ancestral people, and not actual deities. A lot of people mistake that and tend to neglect the reality that an ancestral tradition was very strong among most European cultures, considering that the European cultures were Euro-Asian and Euro-African, meaning that Europe and parts of North and West Africa had a lot of contacts and a lot of shared customs and traditions. So pretty much either way you look at it, ancestral traditions tend to be far more widespread. So to automatically jump to the conclusion that a figure's name is automatically a divine being in origin is actually a fairly fictional construct of what the reality most likely is, just based on what we know about surviving cultures in the present age that actually have those legitimate roots, that haven't been so heavily smeared and warped and distorted from other influences, which there are very few to next to none that haven't had some kind of influence from somewhere. But to arbitrarily just kind of try and paint this, whole box that every single triadic representation represented this modern Maiden Mother Crone concept, quite frankly, is a bunch of modern horse shit. And that is reality. Now, if you have embraced a duality of a god figure and a goddess figure, that's fine. That's what you choose. That's fine. But don't try to pull things from other cultures and then try to cram them in to a pattern that don't belong, because you're being disrespectful both of the figures in question that you're representing, and you're also being disrespectful of the cultures themselves from which they come from, and you're actually falsifying history, preventing people from actually knowing the reality, and that makes you just as much a liar as those as you accuse of distorting the information in the first place, if all you do is throw in more distortions. Now, as I've stated in my previous video about how to consider the one god, three goddesses, when I made the statement that each one of the three goddesses have triadic forms, as God has triadic forms, is actually a very clear and factual statement that can be traced to several examples throughout many different sources. And like I said before, I summed it up with examples, but it basically presented the fact that all three of the goddesses, just like the god, have creative, preserving, destructive aspects. And I gave examples as how to visualize it, but I also made it very clear not to try and force it all in there when there are some supports for that, but there's also other parts that are contrary to it, and it depends on which source you go to, like either Hesiod or Homer or whatever particular source you go to. And that's the thing that people don't tend to actually do. They take one part and they run with it, and they don't look at the whole picture. Whereas what I try to do is I try to look at the whole picture and see the comparisons on what actually do correlate and can respond, and that's the difference between eclectic and mere appropriation. And that's one of the things that most people have actually missed with the whole concept of being eclectic. Eclectic isn't just trying to take all the best parts of one thing and trying to mush them in together on unrelated things, trying to take all the best things about this and that and try to piece it together in some incoherent, do whatever you want to thing. That isn't even how the original ancient cultures worked. For example, the Greeks had their concept of Shai, and the three goddesses associated with the Egyptian Shai, and they saw the comparison with that with the Zeus Moregetes and the Morai. Basically means apportioners, but we usually refer to them as the fates. And this was something that the Greeks did before Pythagoras group, the whole Pythagorean thing ever came about. So they had to get the idea from somewhere too, and it's admitted by those sources themselves. They got it from the Egyptians in that particular area. But then you have similar things being made by the Greeks, such as through Philo-Biblos, though he tries to kind of diminish them a little bit and put them on a lesser scale, trying to fit his hypothesis more or less. But it shouldn't be taken as concrete fact, and there's a lot of holes in that just don't line up. So that's something we also have to be careful of. Then we also have to look at the fact that the Romans and the Greeks were just as much about political smearing of other cultures that refused to conform to their particular ideas, what they considered proper standards of what they thought was civilization or a society. In other words, if it didn't have a permanent building complex and an actual city with big stones, then it wasn't considered civilized. Even though we know a lot of cultures that are very nomadic tend to also be very, very civilized and very much about co-reliability with each other. They have to. It's what allows them to survive. And a lot of the factors of the spirituality also reflect those concepts. I also state that not every single culture in the ancient world recognized the divine unity of one god and three goddesses, but a lot of them do. In some forms of different belief systems within India, going back to the Vedic sources. You have Brahma, who's associated with the three mothers of the Vedas, and there are several sources of material that shows that the three goddesses are not three forms of a single goddess, but very much three separate and distinct goddesses under the names of Sarasvati, Savitri, and Gayatri. And then, of course, you have later on the elevation of Vishnu and Shiva into that mix to create the triad of Brahma with the other two as creator, preserver, and destroyer. But these are the things you have to actually do, is go back to the source material. But if you actually look even in the context when you're looking at Shiva, Shiva is also given as having three goddess consorts under the separate names and separate identities as three separate goddesses, as Kali, Parvati, and Durga, or Durga, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Vishnu is given to have three consorts as well under the name of Bhumi, Lakshmi, and Ganja, or Ganji. And that's not always forthcoming, especially in material that comes to us here in the West. But if you actually look at the sources from India, they state, and they're not ashamed to say as much, that there are several different versions of the same subject matter. And while some try to merge them together, others tend to have more, you could say, a purist type view. But that's within their own culture and something they decide for themselves. It's not something we should decide for everyone else. But there are also many other examples, like they're not necessarily creator beings, but they're high up there in the pantheons. Like among the Yoruba, you have Shango, Oya, Oshun, and Oba. Sometimes they're considered one goddess with three forms. Sometimes they're very clearly distinctly, and it depends on which group you go to and which source of the information it comes from. But in the earliest source material that we know of, they were three separate distinct goddesses that later became associated the same. But they also have figures of, forgive me, those folks of you who speak Yoruba, if I pronounce any of this wrong. So I'd be glad to accept any corrections from your actual being part of this culture yourself, Obatala, for the name of the god, and the three goddesses Yimu, Yemaya, and Igben, or Igben. And then, of course, there's that with the Bantu, with Mukasa, and then the three goddesses Nalwanga, Naku, or Neku, and Najimba, or Nejimba. So it's just some examples there where you have one god, three goddesses paired up. And then in some sources, when you look into some of the African Sumerian material, you've got An or Anu, who is associated with the three goddesses Horus, Kaias, and Namu. Sometimes those three goddesses are shown very distinctly as his consorts. Sometimes there's only two of them shown as the consorts, and it's not quite clear on where Namu fits in, or Horus, or anything like that. So, but people tend to try to force this duality concept only of Anu and Kaya, when there was a lot more to it than that. And that's just an example. But then, of course, you also have the name for God among the monotheistic sources, which is El, who a lot of times are shown to have three distinctive wives, given as Astarte, Asertu, and Astarte, or Astaroth. Each one of these three goddesses have many different diverse names, and they're all collectively called the Ashura, which in itself is plural, whereas the single tended to be more of an Asurat, to the masculine Ashur, which is actually another little tidbit of history there. So anyway, the point is, the Maiden Mother Crone thing is a modern concept, and it's not consistent with the ancient cultures people try to rip names from and just squish them in there to suit their own egos. And you wonder why anything may, if it does exist, may not be responding to people, because you're talking to a philosophical concept rather than a spiritual foundation. It's just something to think about. Talisman Skulls.